Thank you, Christoph. Very pleased to be here, and very glad also to be giving this talk because it's one of my favourite talks, and also in some ways I like to think quite an important one. And what I'm going to do in this talk to you today is to speak about something which is historically almost forgotten, and that is the way in which the welfare function of society was met or delivered in the years before the rise of the welfare state in the early and middle part of the 20th century. And this is an enormously important kind of historical story, but it's one that is hardly known. And I think that this kind of lapse in our historical memory is of enormous significance because it leads us to have all kinds of ideas about the current way of delivering the welfare function through the welfare state that are deeply mistaken. Above all, the idea that the current set of institutions that we have is inevitable, or that there is no alternative for anyone who takes their moral responsibilities and duties seriously. Now, there is always in any human society what you might call a welfare function. That's to say, a set of institutions and practices through which you get relief and help to the poor and the indigent. As far as Christians are concerned, there is also, of course, an enormously important part of the moral teaching of all of the churches that is devoted to this. One of the very last things that Jesus told his disciples was, "The poor you will always have with you." And all of the churches have taught that there is a moral duty or obligation upon Christians, and indeed upon human beings in general, to assist the indigent, the poor, the unfortunate, to relieve their distress, and also to provide mutual help and assistance to all people in society. And traditionally, a lot of the teaching follows on from a gloss upon the famous passage in the 25th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus describes the Last Judgment, and where the distinction between the saved and the damned is based upon how far they have not performed or have performed the corporeal acts of mercy, as the church calls them, giving food to the hungry, clothing to the naked, help and assistance to the sick and imprisoned, and so on. Now, what this doesn't answer, though, is how that duty is to be discharged, or how the social function of assisting the unfortunate is to be actually met. And there are many, many ways, in fact, in which this can be done. Now, today, a great part of this is done through the institutions of the welfare state. Through things such as the state provision of healthcare, and through, above all, what are known as income transfers, a whole range of benefits, cash handouts or other kinds of supplements and assistance given to the less fortunate or the less well-off, and funded out of taxation laid upon the majority and administered and delivered by the institutions of government. And this is such a large part of our lives, such a large part of the public world of pretty much every developed country to one degree or another, that we simply take it for granted. We assume that this is how things have to be, and also we assume that this is how it always has been. We cannot imagine even perhaps that there has been a time when the welfare state did not exist, and to the extent that we know that there was a time when it did not exist, we assume that the time before it must have been pretty horrible, because all these needs and obligations, we think, must not have been met. Now, this is simply not true. I'll say two quick points before I move on, one of which I'll expand upon, the other of which I think will be brought out in Philip Booth's talk, which you're also going to get in a moment. The first is that the welfare state is not a response to failure. In other words, the people who created the welfare state did not do so because and as a result of a failure to meet the welfare needs of society. It was not, in other words, something that stepped into a vacuum. It was something that replaced something that had previously existed. And the motives for creating it were not simply to respond to a major public failure, if you like, of institutions or a practice. And secondly, it's often thought that the welfare state is an expression or an outgrowth of collectivism. And in some ways, this is true. In particular, it's an outgrowth of nationalism. But it's very important to realize that the modern welfare state is also closely associated with a certain kind of individualism. This is something I think that Philip may well say something about. What the welfare state is also strongly associated with is the practice of shoving off your personal responsibilities and your moral duties onto the agency of government, so that instead of actually delivering the kind of actions that your moral duties and obligations lay upon you, you think that these are discharged on your behalf by some kind of government agency, and that as long as you're paying taxes, you have met those obligations. And that seems to me to be an extremely dangerous and actually morally corrupting kind of argument. So the idea that there's a contradiction between individualism and the welfare state is actually to get it wrong and almost back to front in many ways. The contemporary welfare state is actually strongly associated with a kind of atomistic individualism which can and has done a great deal of harm. Now, one of the things that you heard in Martin's first lecture was about the arguments of Pope Pius in Quadragesimo Anno, and he made precisely this point I'm going to now elaborate, which is that before the state appeared, there was an enormous provision of various kinds of social needs through civil society, through intermediate institutions, through voluntary action of all kinds. And what has happened is that the state has taken over all of these functions, including, as we'll see, the welfare function. And in doing this, it has both weakened society, weakened personal responsibility, but also, paradoxically, weakened itself, because it has taken on functions and responsibilities that it is not equipped to discharge, I should say, that it is not the best instrument for, and has also taken upon itself burdens that actually threaten, in Europe in particular, but also elsewhere, to bring about its bankruptcy and its collapse, because it is a simple and brutal fact of mathematics, actually, that the politicians on our behalf have made all kinds of welfare promises and undertakings which, quite simply, mathematically, will never be met. And one of the questions for your generation, I think, is that of how we're going to confront the reality in the next couple of decades of all these promises and legally binding obligations having been entered into, which simply cannot be met or discharged unless completely unrealistic assumptions about economic growth are met. So what are some of the other means by which the welfare function of society has historically been delivered, the kind of things that the Pope was talking about back in that encyclical in the interwar years? Well, one of the most obvious, of course, is the family. We should never forget that the family exists for a whole number of reasons, and one of them is mutual support and sustenance. Family is historically a great source of support, help and assistance to people in times of misfortune, whether financial or emotional or otherwise. Another is friendship. Friendship, close relations with other people to whom you're not related biologically, is again an enormously important social institution. The Greeks actually had a word for love which meant friendship. Typically, for the Greeks, they had several words that we translate by the one word love, and one of these is the word that refers to friendship, amity, as the French call it. And again, this is an enormously important institution and social practice, one that has been, I think, seriously undermined in the contemporary world by the policies of government and also by, I have to say, certain other developments, technological and otherwise. And of course, there's also the great tradition of philanthropy and charity. Now, when people think about alternatives to the welfare state, or what happened before the welfare state was created, they tend to think that the only real alternative was charity. And truly, there was a large amount of charity in the years before the welfare state was created. So in Great Britain, for example, according to all of the evidence that we have, the middle classes and the rich gave at least 10% and often as much as 20% of their income to charity, which is a truly staggering amount and far, far higher than the kinds of donations that are made today. In addition to financial donations, there was also an enormous tradition of charitable volunteering, of people performing charitable work, becoming visitors for the sick and the infirm, for example, or of doing the kind of work which would help poor people to get back on their own feet, if you will, to rediscover their independence and recover from hardship. So it wasn't just a matter of giving money, there was also an enormous amount of actually carrying out charitable work. And philanthropy is indeed enormously important, but it's important to realise that it was not actually the main means by which the welfare function was discharged in the years before the welfare state. It was rather a kind of supernumerary or additional kind of activity to something else. It's worth saying also that there is always a kind of risk in charity. And the risk arises from the nature of the charitable relationship between the giver and the recipient. And the great danger always is that, in fact, despite the good intentions and the charitable aims of the giver, the relationship will corrupt the recipient. It will create a relationship of dependency, or it will actually lead them to, for example, persist in bad or self-destructive patterns of behaviour that have actually caused the problem that's led to the charity in the first place. So the famous example is that, which is used by reformers, was that if you just gave money to beggars you meet in the street, who may be, for example, alcoholics or drug addicts, then you're not actually going to help them, because despite your good intentions, your virtuous intentions in fact, what you're doing is supporting them in a habit that is actually deeply self-destructive and has brought them to the condition that they are now in, where you have to give them charitable assistance. And so historically there was in fact a large movement at the end of the 19th century, the so-called charity organisation movement, fronted in the Anglo-Saxon world by something called the Charity Organisation Society, which aimed at making charity more, as they called it, discriminating, more effective at actually changing people and helping them to sort themselves out, if you will, rather than just being a matter of simply giving handouts. And in many ways you can see the welfare state as being the kind of nationalisation of charity, in which charity is given not on an individual basis but collectively. And what you end up with is all the bad and dangerous aspects of charity, but none of the virtue-enhancing and beneficial aspects of it. However, as I say, and this is the main point, charity and philanthropy, while enormously important and a key part of Christian social practice and living, was not actually historically the main means by which the welfare function of society was discharged. And so to say that there are alternatives to the welfare state is not to say, repeat, not to say, that we are advocating or that you are advocating a society in which charity is the replacement for state welfare. So what was the main way in which the welfare function was discharged rather than charity? And the answer is mutual aid. Now, mutual aid is not the same thing as charity. That's the first thing to understand about it. Mutual aid is the process by which people, typically of modest means or even limited means, get together through free cooperation, the kind of free association that you heard about earlier today, in order to pool their resources and to meet common ends and needs. So in some ways it sounds a bit like insurance, but it's not a commercial activity. It has, as we'll see, an enormously important social aspect to it. And it's the process above all, therefore, by which individual people help each other collectively. So it's collective self-help, if you will. That's the key feature of mutualism, of mutual aid. It's a social process which creates institutions. Institutions formed by voluntary cooperation by which people provide for mutual support and assistance. So people will join together to form an association that will provide common services to each other, but which also will provide aid and assistance to any one particular member of that group or association if they fall into ill health, for example, if they lose their job, if they need assistance of some kind or other in, for example, finding employment or improving their conditions and prospects in life. Now, this used to be an enormously widespread phenomenon. It was one of the most important features of the social life of all of Europe and all of European societies' overseas offshoots, and also of the Islamic world. This is, in fact, almost a human universal, I have to say. Now, what were its origins? Well, in the European case, the origins of the kind of things I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment are to be found in the brotherhoods and free associations of the Middle Ages, of which there were an enormous amount for all kinds of purposes, some of which may strike us as actually slightly comical. I'm sure you're all familiar with orders, of course, religious associations, but there were an enormous range of secular associations in the Middle Ages as well, trade associations and guilds, brotherhoods and associations of all kinds. I remember once visiting the town of Siena in Tuscany. If you haven't been there, you should go. A very beautiful part of the world. And I arrived 2 weeks before something called the Palio, which I soon discovered is the big event of the year in that part of the world. The Palio is a kind of crazy horse race which lasts about 4 minutes, but the entire town is totally driven by this event. And pretty much everyone in Siena belongs to one of a number of brotherhoods. And the whole point of these brotherhoods is that they're like social clubs, but also each one of them has a horse in the palio. And the rivalry between the brotherhoods to win the palio is quite intense, I have to say, as I soon realise. So those are the origins then of classic mutual aid. They are to be found in the long-standing history of voluntary associations, brotherhoods, fraternities and the like that you find throughout medieval Europe. The same is true in other parts of the world, notably, for example, as I said, in the Islamic world, where you have the institution of the waqf, or the charitable foundation, which is slightly different in some ways, but which again often leads to the formation of various kinds of associations. Similar things in China, historically, and India. Now, what happens in the world of industry, however, after the so-called Industrial Revolution, is that these kinds of associations undergo an enormous and explosive growth. Now, one of the common notions that's often found is that industrialization, the growth of large cities in places like Manchester, London, the Ruhr, other parts of the world, Vienna, for example, near here, the growth of enormous urban agglomerations was somehow socially destructive. That what it did was to destroy the close-knit community of the pre-industrial village and replace it with this kind of atomized modern city made up of millions of isolated individuals. There's an element of truth in that picture. But what that story overlooks is the other side of the new urban life of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And that is the way in which these large cities made social cooperation and social collaboration much easier than it had been before. Because think of it this way, if you are living in a village, say in Upper Austria or the Tyrol in the pre-industrial era, the next village is half a day's walk from where you live probably. You live in a village with a population probably of about 100 to 200 people. The chances that you can form some kind of association or society with these people are actually quite low, simply because there aren't that many people you can associate with without incurring significant costs in terms of time, the time it takes to find people, get in touch with them, and all the rest of it. Now, if you're living, on the other hand, in late 19th century Vienna, a city of over 1 million people, it only takes you a matter of minutes to find other people who share common needs or ends or interests with you and to form associations with you. And so the actual process of industrialization and modern technology actually makes voluntary association and cooperation between individuals much easier. And so what you get in the 19th century is an enormous growth of voluntary associations of all kinds, including in particular something I'm going to be talking about, which is friendly societies, but more about that in a moment. As I say, this is found in all parts of Europe. There is a popular notion amongst many historians that this kind of process was more common in the Protestant parts of Europe, such as Lutheran Germany, Scandinavia, Britain, particularly England and Scotland, of course, and other places like that, than it was in the Catholic parts of Europe. But actually that is not true. It was found equally in both the Catholic and the Protestant parts of Europe. And many of the leaders of the Catholic Church in the 19th century were both strong supporters of this kind of movement and very interested in it. So the second Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Manning, was a great supporter of this kind of movement, this kind of association. It was one of his major interests, and indeed the relief of the poor was one of his major parts of his mission as Cardinal Archbishop. It's worth pointing out that although we tend often to think of this now as being an Anglo-Saxon thing, that if anything, the part of Europe where both the practice and the theory of this was most developed was the German-speaking parts of Europe. And I was pleased to notice that Father Martin mentioned one of my very favourite German thinkers, Anton Schulze-Delitzsch, who was one of the great theorists of voluntary association, mutual aid and mutualism in the 19th century. He's a man who's almost forgotten now, but you should really try to rediscover him because he's a very important figure in both the political history of 19th century Germany, but above all in what I'm going to speak about, which is the practice of mutual aid and mutual associations. So what kind of kinds of mutual associations did you have? Well, you had specialized societies. So you had societies formed, for example, for the study of an academic discipline, voluntary learned societies as they were called, of which there were a huge number. There were things like voluntary dispensaries, which were societies or clubs that would give out medicine. Some of these still survive, but typically only for animal relief these days. So in England, we have a thing called the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, which is a kind of charity cum association that provides free or very cheap medicines for sick pets and things of that sort. In England, we have the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, which is a voluntary association that to this very day provides the public service of lifeboats all around the British Isles. It's an entirely voluntary organisation, made up of association of people who live in various kind of seaside towns. But in addition to these specialised ones, you had other ones which were more wide-ranging. We had a whole range of financial institutions. Workers' savings banks, Germany in particular, led the way in developing this, with both Schulze-Delitzsch and Raffison, who had a slightly different idea about how to do this, creating a great network of working-class-driven collective voluntary savings banks. And so you have an enormous range of financial institutions of all kinds, credit unions, saving banks, mutual funds, various kinds of insurance funds, which are set up collectively by people getting together, forming a voluntary association to provide this kind of financial service. This is another major aspect of it. And there's also, however, the big one, which is friendly societies. So what are friendly societies? Well, friendly societies are essentially clubs, if you will, associations formed by mutual association, as I said earlier, amongst people of average, or in many cases well below average, means and income. And they are formed in order to provide protection against contingency, against bad things happening to you, and for the relief of distress amongst their members. Not specifically non-members. That is one of the important things about them, is that while they may engage in charitable activity, that's like a kind of bolt-on or add-on. Their core function is to provide relief and assistance to the people who are part of the association. Now, they come in a number of forms and shapes. You have trade societies, where what you get is an association of people who typically practice a similar trade of one kind or another. And obviously these are closely related to trades unions, and indeed most trades unions historically originate as friendly societies. They acquire some of their other functions, such as wage negotiation, later on in their history. That's actually not their original primary purpose. There are many which are local. In other words, they are formed in a particular locality and they draw their membership from the people in that locality. Literally thousands of these throughout Europe. What you tend to get as the century progresses is the formation also of very large national societies. So in England, for example, you have things like the Hearts of Oak Friendly Society, which has members from all over the country. It has just over 500,000 members by the 1920s. The Prudential, which is now a large assurance company, was also originally one of these national friendly societies. But these do suffer from certain slight disadvantages. One of the disadvantages of being in a trade society or a local society is that if you have a trade recession which affects a particular locality or a particular trade, then suddenly all of the members of the association fall into hard times at the same moment. And this is actually very difficult to deal with. On the other hand, a national society has the problem that there's a lack of engagement on the part of the members, because if you're one of the 500,000 members of the Hearts of Oak Society and the Heart of Oak Society covers the whole of England and Wales, as it did, then it's very difficult for you as one member to have any kind of real involvement in the running of the society or its administration. And so what became the most popular and successful kind of friendly society was what was known as the affiliated order. This was a kind of society which was national, but which was organised on the basis of local branches, usually called lodges, because in many cases they copied the organisational structure of Freemasonry. And so these kind of societies have a national conference, but they consist of individual lodges. And if you are a member in freestanding of one lodge, you are able to go to any other lodge. If you go from one town to another, then you just take a letter and your membership is transferred from your lodge to the lodge of the area to which you've moved. Now what this means is that these societies, these large affiliated orders, organise people from a whole range of trades and occupations, and they also have people from right across an entire country or even the world. So some of the largest ones are actually international, with branches all over the planet. And this means that they are not subject to the kind of problems that a local society may have of all of its members becoming unemployed, for example, at the same time because a particular town or region suffers a localised trade recession. Some of these are quite famous and well known. So, for example, the Knights of Columba or the Knights of Pythias, both of which are associated with the Catholic Church. The Oddfellows, the Honourable and Ancient Order of Oddfellows Manchester Unity, to give its full title, which is the one that I belong to. I'm a proud member of the Oddfellows, have a card, and they have almost uniquely chosen to keep their lodge structure with great success, I might add. Say something about that at the end. There's also the Foresters, the Shepherds, the Noble and Ancient Order of Gardeners, who claim to have been founded by Adam. He was the first gardener, after all. Or my own favourite, the Royal and Antediluvian Order of Buffaloes. Antediluvian because they claim to have been founded before the flood. And if you go around old parts of working class pubs in England, you'll often see over the door RAOB, which means that a Buffaloes lodge used to meet in that pub. And there are many, many other examples of these. The Rechabites, for example, the Salford Unity, as it was also called, which is an important society in the north of England. Many, many though. I mean, quite literally, there are thousands of them. Now, I'll just say something, in fact, about the scale of the phenomenon that I am talking about. We have literally thousands of these societies. The largest ones, such as the Oddfellows or the Foresters, have literally millions of members worldwide. The Oddfellows have something like 500,000 members in the British Isles alone. Some of the continental societies are of an equivalent size. In England, which is or Britain I should say, very careful about that actually, which is the area I know about because it's where my research has been, in 1900, 90% of all working men of adult age were members of a friendly society. Almost 40 to 50% of women of working age belonged to a friendly society as well. And the ones who did not were typically given household benefits which accrued to them by virtue of being married to a man who was a member of a friendly society. So we're talking about very large societies which permeated civil society. You were very unusual if you did not belong to a friendly society of some kind or other. There were so many of them to choose from as well. There was enormous competition between them. And the whole of the welfare function of society, generally speaking, was delivered by these associations. And the degree to which they were simply taken for granted and accepted as being part of the normal life of ordinary people can be seen in some of the older aspects of popular culture. I'm sure many of you will have seen the famous Hanna-Barbera cartoon, The Flintstones. And if you may remember, whenever Fred and Barney want to get away from Betty and Wilma, they go to the Water Buffaloes Club. And this is because even as late as the early 1950s, when Hanna and Barbera were drawing those cartoons, most working class Americans would belong to a friendly society, such as the Elks, or the Ancient Order of Moose, or the Eagles, or the Knights of Columba, or one of the many, many others that existed. And so they could make this illusion in a cartoon and expect that everyone would get it. Now nobody really understands what on earth is going on when Fred and Barney go to this lodge and put on funny hats and behave in a strange way and try to get up to stuff that the wife doesn't know that they're doing. Now, what though did they do? Well, they did a whole range of things. One of them was just simple sociability. If you belonged to a friendly society, you typically had a club that you could go to. Sometimes they met in pubs, very often had their own buildings, and they would provide leisure and entertainment activities of all kinds, sociability, which is important because what it did was provide mutual friendship and fellowship amongst the members. It strengthened relationships between the people. It worked against the kind of social isolation that you might otherwise have in the large modern city. But more to the point from the welfare function of society, they provided a whole range of benefits. They typically provided educational benefits. They would put on educational programs, lectures, talks, later on film showings or showings of slides and pictures. They would provide educational nights. Quizzes were very popular as a way of trying to educate the public. Religious education was actually an extremely important aspect of the work of many of these societies. They also provided, though, enormous amounts of protection against various kinds of misfortune. So they would provide protection against loss of earnings due to sickness or unemployment. If you became unemployed or became sick, you could then apply to the lodge or your society for relief, and you would be given cash payments to help you. Now, it's important to realise these cash payments are not charity. They are something that you have a right to by virtue of the fact that you have been a contributor. In other words, you acquire the right to the relief if you become unemployed or sick by virtue of the fact that you have been paying into a pot. So this is not charity, it's mutual help by all of the members of the association. Return to that in a moment. They also provided healthcare functions. What the friendly societies did was to buy the services of doctors under what was known as the panel system, by which, let us say, we are all members of an Oddfellows Lodge. What the lodge will do is employ a doctor on a flat rate fee per capita basis. So he will be paid a flat rate fee depending on how many members of the lodge there are, so much per member. And what that means is that once he's been paid that fee, if you're ill or sick, we call out the lodge doctor and he comes and provides a service to you. The doctors hated this, by the way. They hated it, not least because also what the lodge would do is determine what kind of services the doctor would provide. And the doctors did not like this. They wanted to be in a position where they could tell you what they were going to do. And in fact, actually, historically, it's the doctors who, more than any other group, are responsible for lobbying for legislative and other changes that undermine the friendly societies. Now, what this does is partly to get around also the major problem of lack of knowledge. One of the big problems, allegedly, with the purchase of healthcare by individuals is that there's an information asymmetry. The doctor knows a lot more about healthcare than you do. But when you have a lodge, or even more a large order, which is buying the healthcare on your behalf, the kind of pooled knowledge and the fact that sometimes some of the members will have considerable medical knowledge means that they can get round that information asymmetry. The collective purchaser, the order, the friendly society, doesn't suffer from the same information asymmetry as its individual members do. And so that particular problem is solved or resolved by this kind of method. It also keeps down costs, but it also provides strong incentives both for the doctor and for the purchaser, the friendly society, not to let healthcare costs escalate out of control. So the whole system works extremely well, and it means that healthcare actually is delivered pretty effectively to most of the members of friendly societies. Very often they also club together, the friendly societies, to actually build hospitals. So many of the most important hospitals in Europe and in North America are actually originally built and funded by donations, by subscriptions from the public and by donations from the friendly societies that would then use them. They were not built by governments. They were taken over by governments later, but they're not originally built or generated by them. They also provide a range of other kinds of benefits, and in particular, they come to provide the benefit of old age pensions. Now, initially, this was a slightly problematic area, because when friendly societies were first set up, they started to provide old age benefits and widows' benefits. But they got their actuarial calculations completely wrong. Well, actually, they didn't even make proper actuarial calculations. And one of the things that happens in the 19th century is that people start to live longer because of the rise in living standards that is going on. And so, as a result, in the late 19th century, friendly societies throughout Europe and North America found themselves in some financial distress because they suddenly found themselves with all these obligations that they were finding it very difficult to meet, rather like the welfare state now. However, what happened was this, and this shows one of the advantages of this way of doing things. They were able to adapt very quickly, and by the 1900s they had worked out how to resolve these problems, and they'd now put their pension arrangements on an actuarially sound basis. Interestingly, not something that the political class have done with the welfare state. And the reason, of course, is that the incentives are different. These friendly societies had very strong incentives to work out an actuarially sound basis for the promises and obligations they'd given to their members to pay benefits to them in old age. The politicians, I'm afraid, have no such incentive, or at least not an incentive that they're going to act on, because it's much, much weaker than the incentives that they have to do things which will make them popular and electorally successful, even if it means that they're completely debauching the public finances in the longer run, which is what they've actually done. So there's a huge range of benefits of all kinds that these societies bring. They basically deliver most of the functions that we now think of as being the core functions of the welfare state. So it's a complete illusion, a myth, to think that before the welfare state came along. People were going to starve in the streets if they lost their job. They were at the mercy of brutal force or random charity from strangers. Quite the contrary, there was an enormous network of interrelated social institutions formed by voluntary cooperation which met the needs that are now met by the welfare state, and did so on all of the evidence very, very effectively. Now, why are they better than the welfare state? Because my argument would be not simply that they could do the same job as the welfare state, but also that they did that job better. And that's an important argument, because if there's no real, if it's a case of you have the same job, the welfare function, and it can be done either privately through friendly societies or by the state, but otherwise there's nothing much to choose between the two, then you could argue that, well, there are various technical efficiency reasons why it might be better to do it through government, or this is just more simple, more straightforward. But if you're referring again to the passage from Quadragesimo Anno, which you saw yesterday, there are all kinds of reasons which Catholic social teaching in particular, and Christian social teaching more generally, casts light upon, which tell us that in fact you should not do this, that there are actually many ways in which this voluntary method of providing the welfare function through mutual aid is superior to delivering it through the state. And the first of these reasons is the principle of subsidiarity. The teaching that there are certain things which are appropriate for certain levels, if you like, of organisation, and not for others. There are some things that it is indeed appropriate for government to do, there are things it is appropriate for families to do, there are things it is appropriate for civil society to do. And you're going to get into all kinds of problems if you try to deliver those functions through an inappropriate means or an inappropriate level. And that's the basic reason. But let's look at some other ones. One of the things that friendly societies have is local knowledge. They get around what is otherwise a very serious problem, the knowledge problem. If you have a national welfare system, the people who are administering it at the top, with the best will in the world, just simply do not know enough to deliver those welfare services effectively. You cannot know or tell, for example, if somebody who makes a claim for relief is genuinely ill or sick or a malingerer. You cannot know if the person who is regularly losing their job is simply unfortunate or has some personal problem, which maybe you could help them with, which is leading them to do this. Maybe they have a drink problem, maybe they have some other kind of personal problem that they need help with dealing with. But you just simply can't do that at the level of a national bureaucracy. So what you do instead is you have an endless supply of intrusive and impertinent forms that people have to fill in, and all kinds of very, very detailed regulations, which of course destroy the kind of assistive aspect of the welfare state, and which mean that for the people who are actually its clients, the poor, it's experienced not as being something that is helpful, but as being something that is often highly repressive and intrusive and unpleasant. And there is nothing more dignity destroying than the experience of being a welfare recipient in the modern welfare state. It is actually a terrible position to be in, which is why I'm not sympathetic to the kind of arguments that people who are in receipt of state welfare are simply living a life of ease and luxury. They're not actually. They're having a very unpleasant experience. But this is ultimately caused by the knowledge problem. Now, by contrast, friendly societies have, particularly when the lodge system is used, have detailed local knowledge. A lodge typically has no more than about 50 to 60 members. The lodge committee and the lodge members will know each other intimately. They will know if you are malingering or not. They will know what your circumstances are. They will be able to tailor and adjust the kind of assistance that is given to take account of your personal individual circumstances in a way that, with the best will in the world, a government cannot. Another important benefit of the friendly societies is the way they allow for innovation. It may be the case, actually, that with insurance goods, which is what we're talking about here, if you're going to take a static view of economics, then it might be the case that if you simply want to see the most efficient allocation of a given set of resources, that it makes more sense to have a monopoly provider. But what that overlooks, which is what you see if you take a dynamic view of economics, is that in fact you don't get innovation. And when you have lots and lots of competing friendly societies, lots and lots of different organizations, they will always be experimenting. And some of these experiments will work, most of them will fail. But you have to have failures. The only way to actually discover new and better ways of doing things is by having lots of failed attempts. And so what you will get with this more pluralistic method is lots and lots of innovations. Innovations in organisation, innovations in finance, innovations, as I just described, in ways of helping, making policies more actuarially sound and the like. This doesn't tend to happen with the welfare state, where government, again with the best will in the world, is just not good at innovation. It's the nature of the beast. It just doesn't do it very well. There's also a very important aspect of socialisation associated with friendly societies. One of their major goals is not just to assist people, but to help in their moral development. So the idea is that the process of being in a friendly society will not only provide you with relief against misfortune and mutual help and assistance amongst the members, it will also work to make you a better person. Now, sometimes this can take forms which you might find objectionable. So I mentioned the Rechabites, for example. The Rechabites made you take the pledge never to drink alcohol as part of the membership. A lot of 19th century friendly societies were strongly associated with the temperance movement, with abstinence from alcohol. That's not something I would personally take part in, but you didn't have to in the 19th century. You could always join one of the societies like the Oddfellows or the Foresters or the Buffaloes, who had no problems with you having a drink or two. But what all of the societies did was to set down clear moral standards of behaviour. And part of joining the society was to become a better person, to try and adhere to these moral standards, behaviour of mutual respect, dignity, self-control, self-discipline, thrift, diligence, hard work, and the like. So there was an enormous element of moral reform, which is quite different from the kind of rather hectoring and bullying and intrusive policy that you find with the welfare state. And above all, it's voluntary. If you don't like this kind of stuff, you can always just not join one of these societies and go and get your assistance from a purely neutral medium, such as an assurance society or a national society. There's also a sense that it is based upon a doctrine of personal responsibility and self-government. But this is exercised through voluntary collective action. So in other words, what friendly societies are based upon is an idea of personal autonomy, self-government, personal independence, but it's not an individualist doctrine, because these are realised through collective but crucially voluntary action. And so you have a very powerful and important way in which people are taught through actual practice the principle of self-government, of autonomy. And in terms of the political side of things, it creates citizens because it teaches you how to run and organise and govern an institution in a democratic way. One of the things that these friendly societies led to was, amongst other things, development of what's known as Robert's Rules of Meetings, which are these sort of standard rules that govern public meetings. How you have privileged motions, non-privileged motions, how the speaker has to conduct the meeting, what you have to do, and all that kind of thing. So in other words, they teach through experience the art of civic government. They make good citizens as well as good people. And finally, something I alluded to earlier, these societies are all about rights, not about handouts. They are about, essentially, self-governing institutions which are controlled and set up by ordinary people, working class people for the main part. And therefore, what they create is a system of rights and independence from the state, which is and also from professionals. As I said earlier, the doctors simply hate them, and they're not alone in that respect. Now, why did this all end? Well, there are two things to say about this. The answer is that it's been crowded out by government. The welfare state originates in Germany. I mean, the welfare state's progenitor, its first father, is the well-known communist radical Bismarck. This is done with the creation of what Bismarck called the Sozialpolitik in 1878. Now, if you look at the foundation of the welfare state, you'll see two slightly contradictory things going on. A lot of the founders of the welfare state actually liked the friendly societies and mutual aid. What they thought, however, was that it needed to be supplemented by government. So in the English case, for example, the British case, The modern welfare state is really created in 1942 when the Beveridge Report is published, authored by the well-known Liberal politician and one-time head of the LSE, William Beveridge. But if you read Beveridge's book, he also wrote another work called Voluntary Action. And what his argument was that the bulk of welfare should still be given through friendly societies. But he thought the problem with them was they weren't universal. There was 10 or 20% who were not taking part in this. And so he thought what you did need was a kind of state action to provide the kind of basic universal welfare benefit which would protect people against outright indigence or starvation. And that then on top of that you could have all the more specialised benefits provided by the friendly societies. Unfortunately for Beveridge, and I've no doubt he would be utterly horrified were he to return from beyond the grave and see what has become of the welfare state he helped to create. What happened in practice was that the government swallowed up and crowded out all of the private action. The crucial thing in the British case was that there was a kind of thing called supplementary benefit, which was meant to be a kind of small additional program that would gradually wither away. And what has happened is that it has grown like topsy, and it has now become one of the largest single items in government spending and has crowded out all of the private action of one kind or another. But there's also a slightly more sinister and dark side to this, which brings me back to Bismarck. When Bismarck was advocating the Sozialpolitik, he made a speech in the Reichstag, which in characteristic Bismarckian form was brutally frank. This is not a man who believed in mincing words, after all. And Bismarck says, a man who has a state pension is easier to handle than somebody who does not. And the verb he used, the German verb behandeln, means to actually grab hold of, to have a handle on somebody that you can hold and use to control them. Bismarck is very frank if you read that speech. What he says is, you need to control people. You need to create a common sense of political identity which is controlled by the political class, people like himself. In other words, as well as people who think the welfare state should be there to supplement private action, there are people who think that its main purpose is actually to control people. It's to create a powerful national identity which the political class will control and direct. And also it's linked to paternalism, to the idea that these ordinary people, they do not know what is good for them. Who does know what is good for them? Well, the doctors, basically. And that therefore the paternalistic elite will control them through the welfare state. But the main purpose is, as I say, the creation of a kind of coherent national identity and the destruction of local and private loyalties and identities. Precisely what the Pope Pius was warning against in that passage that you saw yesterday. And that's the dark side of the welfare state, if you will, which we can trace back to people like Bismarck and subsequently. And again, though, the original Bismarckian social insurance scheme was quite limited, but all these things tend to take on a life of their own, not least because they generate very powerful vested interests that then capture the state and lobby the politicians to expand the programs from which they derive various kinds of emoluments, as we call them, and other pecuniary benefits. So, very quickly to conclude, what you should realise is that there is an enormous tradition of voluntary action to meet the welfare needs of society. That this existed and flourished and was highly successful and effective before the creation of the welfare state. The welfare state was not brought into existence because there was a lack of welfare provision or because it was working badly. It was brought in for other reasons, some good and well-meaning, others actually quite malefic. Also, and this is important in the context of this seminar, this is a way of thinking about meeting the welfare function which is in conformity with and in many ways flows from the kind of Christian anthropology, the understanding of what human beings are and what human society is that you heard about from Father Martin yesterday. And it's in line with much of the social teaching of all of the Christian churches, at least until comparatively recently. And so this is an important part of your intellectual and actual history, I think, that you need to recover. And the more that people know about this and that there is this entirely different and in many ways much more beneficial way of meeting the welfare function, the better we will be. And we have to recover it because the other thing I can say quite categorically, and maybe Philip Booth will say something more about this in his talk, I'm not sure, the system we have now is not going to go on. And there's a very simple reason for that. It's because it can't. And that's not an ideological point, that's an elementary mathematical point. And there's no arguing with maths. So at that point I'll stop.